I'm Big Don Luka, smoke you like my hookah. Pump fake right, then I step back in illusion. That's a boss move maneuver, billionaire entrepreneur. Mark Cuban on the viewer, put you rookies on a skewer. I stay shitting on you boys like I came up from the sewer. Used to have a lot of dollars, now I got a lot fewer. What you saying to me? I hope you save it for me. I'm about to kill the game, and I put it in my testimony.
Hi, welcome to the Mainstream Mavs podcast. This is your host, Will. I'm joined here by my co-host, Jaren.
What is up, guys?
Today, we are going to be getting into the Mavericks weekend home-and-home stretch at the Moda Center versus the Trailblazers. Both 17-point losses. One game which Luka Doncic did play in. One game that he did not play in, which I believe he was announced out due to left ankle soreness, if I'm correct.
I'm actually not. I think it was somewhere around there, yeah.
Yeah, it was some sort of load managing tactic, essentially. After the Mavericks lost on the first night of a back-to-back that Saturday night, where they lost 136 to 119 and then 140 to 123. Christian Wood did not play in the first game, but he did play in the second game. Tim Hardaway Jr., I know for a fact, did not play because of an ankle injury in that second game. So, the Mavericks obviously dealing with a plethora of injuries in this game on top of the injuries that they already have to role players Josh Green, Maxi Kleber, and Dorian Finney-Smith, who apparently we could see Josh Green as soon as tomorrow night's game. Wednesday versus the Clippers, I believe.
I think it's the Hawks.
The Hawks?
Yeah, I think it's the Hawks.
I don't know what led me to believe it was the Clippers.
We do play the Clippers soon, so I'm sure that's
okay. Yeah, so that I guess that's where my train of thought was kind of leading. But yeah, Josh Green has been fully scrimmaging 5-on-5, and Jason, media has kind of been on Jason Kidd's head as to why he hasn't played yet and wondering about that. But it seems as if they're kind of just fully vetting him and bringing him up to speed before they really got everything going. So all signs point towards him being back tomorrow night, which is obviously a positive sign. Hopefully with, Luka, Tim, those guys are able to return as well, unless they have something, unless Tim's ankle injury is more severe than we originally thought, or Luka's, whatever he was dealing with is a little more serious than we thought. But nonetheless, we're going to go ahead and be getting into these two games, two eerily similar games that the Mavericks' lack of perimeter defense and inability to stop dribble penetration was on full display. The second game, I would say, was definitely treading in the right direction a lot better than the first one until the Mavericks.
Until the fourth quarter.
Yeah, really until the second half of the third and then the whole fourth quarter. The Mavericks obviously, had a rough 2-game stretch here. Jaren, do you have any thoughts in terms of these 2 games versus the Blazers? Are you particularly disheartened at these losses, or do you think that they were expected with the flurry of Maverick injuries, or are you writing this off kind of as just it's just a weird stretch of the season where we're injured, or do you view this more along the lines of, these 2 losses, particularly because, there is kind of credence to the fact that it is kind of hard to lose 2 times in a row when you're playing a team in the regular season, to lose 2 times in a row to that same team in consecutive games just because of scouting and game planning, you being able to kind of counter whatever happened in the first game. Are you writing this off, especially with the Mavericks not having Luka in that second game and not having Christian Wood in the first game? Or do you think that these losses are actually emblematic of something bigger?
I think the first game is something that you can take away. If anything, if you're trying to point anger towards anything, it should be the first game. That's a game where the Mavericks were essentially full powered up until,
besides Christian
Wood.
Obviously they're dealing with a handful of injuries, but in terms of what they've been,
what we've seen the last few weeks,
what we've seen the last
minus Christian Wood.
Mm-hmm.
And then Tim Hardaway, I think in the third quarter, I think is whenever he had the ankle.
But the game was basically under wraps at that point.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it really didn't matter much. But pretty much from tip off to finish, I think we realized very, very fast in that first matchup how valuable Christian Wood was to this team. Because the second that Dwight Powell got in foul trouble, it kind of just seemed like the Mavericks pretty much put up the white flag and that was it. I know that they weren't really ever close at any point in that game, but even still, I think if you have Christian Wood, it's an automatic fighting chance, as we saw in that second matchup without Luka. But I'm not taking too much credence to that second loss because, again, we didn't have Tim, we didn't have Luka, and of course the 3 other guys that are out. But that first matchup, I think if you're taking anything, it's just, how depleted this center rotation is right now.
Yeah, no. Earnestly in the second matchup, like I was honestly more so impressed more than anything, just due to the fact that if the Mavericks actually did have their full slate of defenders, and it was just a Luka-less game, like we've seen in the past, it may have been a game that they actually would have had a chance at winning if they would have been able to stop the likes of Jeremy Grant and Anthony Simons and Damian Lillard, or just obviously not stop those guys, but just be able to limit them a little more, kind of oust some of that dribble penetration that was so very prevalent within that fourth quarter. I think if they were able to stop that to a degree, then I mean that would have been one of the few games that Luka's missed that they would have actually had a chance to win in. But regarding that first game, definitely there's a huge indictment upon the team in terms of how they were, kind of unable to effectively counter those 4-on-3 scenarios and how good the Blazers were able to trap Luka. I mean, I know the team ended up with 119 points, but there were still some distinguishable offensive issues as well as like a plethora of defensive issues within both games. I think that that's my biggest takeaway. But we also have to recognize that the Mavericks personnel is still heavily fractured by these Josh Green, Dorian Finney-Smith, and Maxi Kleber injuries. And we'll get more into that towards the end of the podcast, where we'll talk about those guys returning and what the rotation is going to look like upon that. Jaden Hardy had a great second game where he had 25 points. It is a career high for him. That is definitely intriguing. I know a lot of Mavs fans are hyped about that. So there's a lot of different topics to get into between these two games. We're definitely going to try to group them together, since even though they are different in nature because of the players that were playing respectively in both of the games being different, they are eerily similar in terms of how the on-court product was for the Mavericks. So I think that those are some compelling narratives we're going to be getting into, and we're going to be getting into all of those, of course. But before we do that, here's an ad from our sponsor, Anchor. All right, Jaren. So getting into it, as we were taking the ad break, it was actually just announced by Brad Townsend of the Dallas Morning News that Josh Green and Dorian Finney-Smith are virtually set in stone to make their return Wednesday night versus the Hawks. Tim Hardaway Jr. did not practice today, so I would presume that means he's probably not going to play tomorrow night, barring something kind of just coming out of left field and inhibiting him to be able to play, because his ankle injury did look kind of wonky. I'm not going to try and play doctor here and act like I know what grade sprain it is or anything like that. But just given the fact that he didn't practice today, track record shows from Jason Kidd, if a guy doesn't practice the day before, then he typically doesn't play the ensuing game. Just based on that information, before we actually get into these two Trailblazers games, you obviously want to cover this. What do you think is going to be different in terms of the Mavericks rotation? If Tim Hardaway Jr. is out for a couple games here, what's the starting lineup going to look like with Dorian and Josh coming back? How are the dynamics of the Mavericks defense going to change up, and even potentially their offense? What all do you think might unfold basically over the next week or two if Dorian and Josh come back and Tim's out? Do you think Dorian and Josh are going to need a sort of built-in time for them to be incorporated? Are they going to be on any sort of minutes restriction? Do you think that they were out long enough, or do you think they're kind of just going to be thrown into the fire? What do you exactly think is going to happen?
Yeah, so I mentally prepared for Josh Green coming back Wednesday night. I wasn't too confident in Dorian, but hearing this news is definitely, amazing. I think those two automatically get inserted into the starting lineup, especially with Tim Hardaway. More than likely, I think at this point we could probably write him off for Wednesday's game, maybe even Friday's game against Miami. But more or less, inserting those two, of course, with the depletion of how depleted this roster has been defensively, I think that those two just automatically lift a huge load off of, Reggie, off of Frank, all these, sort of quote unquote defensive anchors that we have at that current, I guess, while those guys were hurt for the few weeks that they were. Offensively, or I guess let me just dive into what the starting lineup probably will be. I think it'll be Luka, Spencer, Christian, and then Josh and Dorian. It's going to look a little different for the Mavericks. I don't think they've had a starting lineup like that, especially with Tim Hardaway. He just sort of spaces out the floor a little better. I get you have Dorian, who's a 3-point shooter, and even, you can kind of argue Josh Green is a 3-point shooter at this point. But even still, I think that Tim, the volume at which he shoots his shots, he's taking 14 shots a game. Josh is taking at most probably on average 5 to 6, I would say. And same with Dorian. I just don't think, at the volume at which those two shoot, it's going to sort of open up the floor as much as Tim does. But needless to say, I think the Mavericks can change up a little bit on what they do. I know Josh, he likes to run the floor a little bit, run in transition. I think it'll speed the process up a little bit more whenever we do get turnovers. Same with Spencer, and having, sort of a guy that can run with him is going to be huge for him. And I mean, just defensively, I think it writes for itself that those two guys are, arguably our two best defensive players on the team. Getting Dorian a wing defender back, putting Reggie on the bench more than likely. Well, I don't know, starting five, you probably at this point with how Reggie had his 24-point performance, I don't know, we'll see. But yeah, I mean, you get Reggie or Josh on the bench, whoever it is, it just adds a little more defensive depth, of course, at the wing position. And that's something that the Mavericks have been, we all know that they have been hard, or like that they have needed quite a bit, especially with the perimeter sort of defense. So I think, we're going to see a big difference perimeter defensively, and just how the offense is sort of run. I don't think it's going to be, I know that you mentioned is it going to be like a transition getting these two back? Is it going to take a minute for them to get basketball savvy again, or basketball in their shape before they were before their injuries? And I think it's not going to take long. Maybe this game is sort of like a hiccup period, but I really don't think it's going to take that long. I know Josh has been practicing quite a bit. I think that he's more prepared than anything. And then, with Reggie or with Dorian, I'm not sure what his update is. It kind of just seemed like he was, on the road to coming back, but I didn't think he'd come back this soon. So I guess getting him is kind of a treat, but I don't think there's going to be much of a hiccup period. I guess that's what I'm going to say. Offensively, I think it's going to look a little different. I think, like I said, it's going to be running the floor a lot more. And then defensively, of course, is going to be a lot better perimeter defense.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I think in terms of both Josh and Dorian, they've both been practicing, full scrimmage 5-on-5 for, I think, like the last two practices. I know Josh, dating back to before the Portland road trip, was practicing fully 5-on-5. And I know Dorian, I mean, at least was doing today. So that much at least gives me a little bit of confidence that they'll be a little more, sort of tailor-made to get thrown into the fire, instead of it being a scenario where they were kind of rushed to have to get into everything, kind of like maybe like right before a playoff series or something like that, where you're really just trying to rush an injury. They seem like they got really good full recovery periods for both of their respective injuries, especially Josh, who I honestly think went a little over the projected timeline of what somebody typically has that injury is in terms of how long he was out. So I do kind of concur with you there. I mean, we saw a guy even the other night, Nas Little, for the Trailblazers, having not played since, I think, November 29th, and he came in and looked great for them. So I think that there is credence to the fact that it may not take long for them to be incorporated. They may not have a minutes restriction. They could easily come in there and start. I'm intrigued to see how they bring them along, though, like you said, or kind of alluded to. Maybe they run with Reggie instead of Josh because of how good he's been shooting and how persistent he's been lately. I guess really not over an elongated stretch, but really just these last two games, he's shot better, even though his defense has still kind of been very wishy-washy. So we're going to have to definitely see how that all pans out. In terms of how it works out offensively, I still think that Josh and Dorian allow for the floor to be spaced still. They're still both guys that are respectable shooters from beyond the arc. They definitely don't have the track record that a Tim has, who can kind of come off of a curl or a down screen and just basically come up and hit it, or, hit it with a hand in their face. They're definitely not going to be hitting as much of those, heavily contested threes, or as much of those transition threes that Tim's kind of bringing to the table, or, occasionally he'll even pull it off the dribble. They're not probably going to be able to do that. But, you do have to recognize that both of these guys do bring elements offensively that Tim doesn't, particularly, Dorian with his offensive rebounding and his cutting. Josh obviously can work as the primary ball screener when Luka's getting blitzed in a pick and roll, when work as that outlet in a 4-on-3 scenario. We obviously know how he's able to kind of come off DHOs and get downhill and be able to open up the floor with his passing. So I think that it may be different, but I don't know if it necessarily constitutes that it's going to be worse, especially with the defensive versatility that they're going to be bringing on the other end. So we're definitely going to have to see how it pans out. But I think a lot of Mavericks fans early on in the season were definitely sort of idealizing a starting lineup of Spencer Dinwiddie, Luka Doncic, Christian Wood, Josh Green, and Dorian Finney-Smith. And the fact that that might be on the agenda, especially since I don't think that they've really played a whole lot together. I don't have it pulled up on Second Spectrum or anything right here, but I don't think that that lineup has necessarily accumulated a lot of minutes together. But I know a lot of Mavericks fans have been idealizing over it. It was like I believe it was like the cover photo for when the Mavericks busted out the retro jerseys.
I think those were the 5
I think
guys.
that those 5 were on the cover. A lot could argue that maybe if you go name by name, they're not necessarily the best 5 Mavericks. You could probably argue Tim Hardaway Jr. over 1 or 2 of those guys in that lineup. But at the same time, it could end up being the best, like, coordinating, and in terms of how it is able to be synchronized together, it could be the best starting 5 that the Mavericks could bust out. We haven't really seen enough of a sample size to determine that, but obviously the defensive versatility in tandem with still having another ball handler out there in Dinwiddie and still having Luka and Wood on the floor is an intriguing aspect of all this. So it'll be interesting to see how it ends up panning out, like I said. But needless to say, I think the bottom line is that we're excited to get those guys back, and for Tim's sake, I mean, just in terms of the trade deadline coming up and everything, I'm not trying to, throw him out into the hay barrels quite yet. But I guess we'll go ahead and see what exactly happens in terms of Tim and how his, in terms of the asset management with him is treated, because he is a guy that we've kind of identified as being movable around this trade deadline. Now, whether a package actually is able to form around him or anything of that nature, that's another discussion. But he's been a guy that, especially with how well he's been shooting in recent games lately, has been a guy that is probably on the agenda for the Mavericks to move. At least I would presume. Maybe they don't, who knows? But you would think, just on how he's performing versus at the beginning of the season, probably upping his value some, and being a guy who we don't really know how his long-term fit is in Dallas. He really could be on the horizon to be traded. So I hope that his injury isn't serious. And just for a health standpoint, obviously I don't want him being, anybody being hurt for that matter. I want him to get healthy. Even if Tim is not to be traded, he is going to be essential, whether it's starting or coming off the bench. So hopefully that situation unfolds in a positive manner and he's not out for too long. He obviously hurt his ankle the other night in Portland, that first game. But speaking of that, let's kind of move past that and let's get into these 2 games, versus the Trailblazers, of course. So kind of like speaking comparatively in terms of, I kind of want to get into the offense first before we dive into the defensive woes that the Mavericks had in these 2 games. Obviously, the Mavericks put up a combined 242 points in these games. So at face value, you're probably looking at this and like, okay, like what exactly went wrong? They still weathered the storm with Luka out and scored 123, all this and that. But I still do think that there were some pretty identifiable offensive woes that they kind of went through in both of these games, particularly in that first game when Luka was getting blitzed in the 4-on-3. Or rather, it created a 4-on-3 when Luka would get blitzed in the pick and roll. The Blazers kind of deferred to double teaming him almost every single possession. With Christian Wood out, we saw the inability of Dwight Powell to really attack the rim. He definitely opts to pass out of those short roll scenarios a lot, which is definitely beneficial. But a lot of the times the Blazers defense was able to quickly recover out to shooters. And that, while it is something that can be sustainable against some teams that are kind of lackluster on their rotations, the Blazers definitely have some liabilities in terms of the lineups that they run out defensively. And in terms of Lillard and Nurkic, when you involve those 2 guys in a pick and roll, good things can typically emanate out of that. But we do have to recognize that they do have a flurry of wing defenders that are pretty solid at that end, with Jeremy Grant, Shaden Sharp, Josh Hart. Those are all guys who can definitely hedge and recover and get out to shooters pretty fast. And I thought, even though the Mavericks scored a lot of points and they shot well in both of these games, I still kind of felt like there were periods where the offense was stalling out. And if they hadn't had such a good shooting game, they definitely could have bared some negative effects in terms of their offense in both of these games. So, I guess comparatively speaking to both games, what did you see in the first game versus the second game that you thought was better offensively? And what did you see in the second game versus the first game that you thought was better offensively?
I mean, there's a flat out like difference. Of course, in that first game we had Luka and we didn't have Christian Wood, and then in that second game we didn't have Luka, but we had Christian Wood. I just think sort of this lineup difference just creates a lot of like, it creates a huge like, sort of gap and parallel in between these offenses right now. I guess like between these two games. In that first matchup, Luka was getting blitzed at the point of attack and really couldn't get any offense formulated. He finished with only 15 points. I don't know if that's a season low. I think he finished.
It was a season low for him.
Okay, I can remember because I couldn't remember if he had like 13 or 17 in that game he got ejected from. But yeah, no, season low from Luka. And really, I mean, for Portland, they have such a strong five of like defensive players that I mean they can pretty much do whatever they want. They can dictate, especially whenever Christian Wood is someone who can't really operate in a 3-on-4. That's Dwight I'm speaking of. Like Dwight can't really operate in a 3-on-4 scenario.
I mean, he's really good at passing out of those scenarios. I don't want to try
but
he's
like, just
strain him of his credit or anything. But
no, I mean, I'd much more be comfortable with Christian Wood. We've seen it a lot of times this season, where Christian Wood can maintain his water whenever in that scenario he can either take a three, drive in, or dump it off to the dunker spot, whoever is open. But needless to say, it was just really a scramble, pretty much offense. And the Mavericks, I mean, in all fairness, they were able to hit almost 50% of their threes. They hit 22 of 46. But yeah, I think it was just, pretty much just a scramble. It was pretty much a race around the horn. Whoever was open was taking the shot. Luckily, it was, Reggie Bullock making 8 of 10 of his 3-point field goals. And then, of course, Davis Bertans was going off a little bit here and there. But I mean, I just don't know. Like, between that second game, I guess Spencer also made some threes, but between that second game and the first game, it was like really just a big difference and how the offense was run. Like that first game was definitely just much more scramble, I guess. And then that second game was honestly run pretty well. The Mavericks were keeping up with the Blazers quite often up until, as you alluded to in the intro, that was like halfway through the third and basically the whole fourth. And I mean, like, with Christian Wood on the floor, like I said, you just can do a lot more things. Even whenever Luka's out, there's just a lot more things that you can do with Christian Wood on the floor. And he was able to pretty much exploit that for the Portland defense. Nurkic is a guy that isn't really used to, I guess, stepping out. Dwight, much more offensively, I would say, definitely doesn't hit the threes, but he can at least space the floor a little bit, just in the sense that he's an athletic big. But yeah, I mean, I just, it was able to space the floor out a lot more, and the Mavericks were able to keep up scoring in that second matchup up until that third quarter and fourth quarter, of course. But just that first matchup was just pretty much scramble offense. And the Mavericks, I mean, to their credit, they hit what I said, like 48% of their threes. But definitely had it been like more of a usual night from the 3-point line, it probably would have looked a lot different.
No, 100%. I think it was really interesting to see the stark differences in play style when we go game to game. Like it was very much heliocentric in terms of the Mavericks operating around Luka per usual in that first game versus in the second game. We saw a lot more ball movement around the perimeter. A lot of guys that maybe normally don't try to attack off a closeout, try to, furbish themselves with inside the paint and create driving lanes for themselves. Not necessarily saying that operated successfully every time, but it was definitely a different look. We saw the Mavericks run a lot more in transition in that second game.
Yeah.
That first game, the Mavericks shot very well, as you alluded to, 22 for 46 from 3. Spencer, I think, had a great positive regression shooting game. He went 4 for 6 from 3 in that game, 8 for 12 from the field. He was just pulling it, man, and he was doing a great job of it. I mean, both games he shot really well, but his assertiveness in the second game with Luka being out was definitely, emblematic of a guy who knew what he had to do with some, with the best player being out, and he definitely got after it. So I was definitely happy that he, exploited mismatches and things of that nature in that second game, even more so. But I mean, he had a great game playing off of Luka in that first game, offensively at least. And it's kind of weird. Like we see a game here, of course, where the Mavericks shot the ball extremely well in that first game, 22 for 46, yet they still lose by 17. I guess that was kind of what I was referencing to, is like the offense seemed to stall at some points, because in the time periods where the Mavericks really couldn't create open shots, there was really no offense being generated, but they were kind of able to tread water just due to the sheer amount of threes that they were making. Reggie was shooting was operating in the pick and pop with Luka a ton in that game. The Mavericks were, really swinging it out of the perimeter once they got the ball moving in those 4-on-3 scenarios, with when Powell was able to kind of get it out there. But the Mavericks weren't really able to play with pace, and the 3-point shooting was not sustainable game to game, kind of as we saw. I mean, not to the degree that it was in the first game where they shot 22 for 46. So, speaking of that second game specifically, obviously the Mavericks not operating offensively really as much with that heliocentric play style. Spencer was definitely the lead ball handler, but we saw definitely probably a sort of increased prerogative by the Mavericks to get the ball to different guys. McKinley Wright and Jaden Hardy played a lot more, and those guys attacked and ran out and transitioned more. So, even Frank offered a little bit of offensive variety in that second game where he was taking some mid-range pull-up shots, was trying to get to the rim a few times. So they definitely tried to weather the storm by committee, which was a really interesting look versus kind of having Spencer as your bailout guy and then Luka, dribbling the ball most of the possession and trying to create something out of that, and having Dinwiddie as, because Dinwiddie is a secondary playmaker on this team. There's a lot of points in time, especially amidst this Luka stretch, where Luka has just been, so damn good offensively that it's like, okay, why do we even go to Spencer to try and alleviate any sort of stress from Doncic on this possession? Because, it's almost a guaranteed bucket from some person that, either Luka's going to create an open shot or he's going to be able to get a good shot for himself. But to see, that's why I guess I was so impressed with how Spencer was kind of able to operate game to game, playing second fiddle in that first game, still being, having a really good shooting night. Had he not shot the ball that well, maybe he doesn't score that much, of course, but then coming in the second game and still being that lead ball handler, but also not to a point where it seemed heliocentric or Doncic-esque. He was still getting the ball around the perimeter, and guys were attacking off closeouts, and guys, we saw some Hardy pick and rolls at times. We saw McKinley Wright operating within the pick and roll, trying to create some own offense for himself. So that sort of variety game to game was really cool. And I definitely am really happy with this stretch that Spencer had amidst these two games. But nonetheless, talk just about that second game, how the Mavericks were able to stay with Portland offensively, at least up until really that third quarter, halfway mark, just from weathering the storm with all these different role players, in Ntilikina, McKinley Wright, Jaden Hardy, those guys being able to step up and fill a void that Luka left, of course. Not to the extent that, they weren't able to fill all of the whole shoe that Luka left, but they were maybe able to fill it up to where, maybe there was only space for maybe another big toe or two in there. That was a weird analogy, but we're just going to roll with it because it kind of sort of made sense. So how do you think that the Mavericks were able to weather the storm a little more in that second game offensively and just keep pace with the Blazers until their defense fell apart, while they had to do it by committee with Luka out, of course, and, they were relying upon these other ball handlers? And do you think that that's going to be sustainable game to game?
Yeah, this was quite literally the definition of like ball handler by committee. We saw Frank, we saw Spencer, of course. We even saw Christian Wood bring it up a little bit. Jaden Hardy. I think that, in terms of ball handling, that's pretty much about it. But that's four guys right there that brought the ball up probably more than 3 times this game. I know Spencer was definitely the more, I guess he definitely brought it up the most in this game. But we saw Frank, he even got 7 assists in this one. Frank is much more of, at least in the second matchup, he was much more of like a facilitator, I would say. He only went 1 of 5, but he was opening up the floor a little bit and just what he can do on his passing. And more or less, he was, I don't even know how to say it. Like, he was able to drive in the floor and then kind of kick it out to guys. The Mavericks didn't shoot like an insane clip from 3, but even just Spencer driving sort of opened up the floor a little bit. As we see, with Luka, what he does so well is, he drives and it pretty much magnifies the defense in automatically and creates open shooters. We got to see a little glimpse of Spencer doing that in the sense he finished with 9 assists in this one, pretty much solely either due to, the touch pass here and there on a, around the horn scenario, or driving in and just finding an open corner shooter. We even saw Christian Wood. He got off to a little bit of a slow start in this one, and I mean he didn't finish with insane numbers, but we definitely saw him clean up the boards. He he got an amazing 16 boards. Was really like the only guy that could grab a rebound in this game. I mean we finished where we saw some guys sort of alleviate the rebounding category, but Christian Wood was definitely huge in this one. But yeah, I mean it was just much more of a, I don't want to say basketball sort of game, but the Mavericks were able to, I guess, have more guys involved other than, the usual 1, 2, or 3. We saw Christian Wood, Reggie got involved there. Dwight finished with 10 points. Spencer, of course, Davis, McKinley Wright had a moment here and there. And then, of course, Jaden Hardy. I mean, Jaden Hardy was huge in this game just with the sense of driving and running the floor whenever in transition. But yeah, I mean, I think the, big thing that take away from this second game was just, honestly, how well the Mavericks handled the situation. I think that this was by far the best game that the Mavericks have played without Luka. I believe they're 0-5 now without him, but even still that one at halftime felt like a win because I think they were only down by 5 or something like that.
They took the lead in the third quarter.
Yeah, they did take, they had a lead at one point in the fourth quarter or third quarter early on, I believe. And yeah, I mean, my confidence definitely rose in this team. But needless to say, it definitely fell apart throughout that game and throughout the second half. But just offensively, I think it was a different look for the Mavericks. They were able to, sort of run the ball with different guys, and that's a look that the Mavericks just haven't seen at all. Even in those Luka-less games, the first few ones, I mean, it was pretty much just all Spencer trying to do work, or Christian Wood trying to do work. And this was the first one where I think the Mavericks actually held their water, actually got guys involved that necessarily aren't usually involved, aka Frank. Hardy again had a huge game. But I think that this was definitely a glimpse of, what could be if the Mavericks just not what could be, but this is definitely, if ever Luka gets hurt, this is probably the offense that the Mavericks run with, bearing a trade or anything like that. So it was honestly pretty promising, again, up until that second half, but I was pretty pleased with it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess for me, I would probably push back in terms of my expectations for this. I think that the Mavericks definitely, I mean, I don't know. I just don't think I've seen enough of a sample size in terms of, how just, outright bad those first 4 games without Luka were, and the ball handling by committee situation not really being able to mend itself. For me to label this game versus the Trailblazers as a sort of cure-all or like give me any confidence going forward that they can sustain playmaking, without Luka on the floor. But it was nice to see that they were able to do so in a game like this. I will say as much, while the Blazers do have like really good wing depth and wing defenders, a lot of their issues do lie from the standpoint that, when you're running Anthony Simons and Lillard out there, those obviously aren't the 2 strongest defenders at the point of attack. So you can only, especially in that starting lineup that they do play a lot together, they obviously have a kind of a plethora of guys to throw at you off the bench, and Nas Little, who played in the second game and not the first. Gary Payton, of course, who's probably one of the best defenders in the league. Shaden Sharp, Jeremy Grant, Josh Hart. Like, these are all, great defenders. Don't get me wrong. But they do operate with that starting lineup quite a bit. We do have to recognize that, of course. And, within that starting lineup, Simons and Lillard, you can really only kind of stick Hart on one of Dinwiddie or, Ntilikina or whatever. And, a lot of times Hart would have to, one of those wing guys would end up getting switched onto Wood and would have to defend him if Nurkic was just kind of getting torched in the pick and roll or wasn't out there, things of that nature. So I do think that the Mavericks guard play was kind of able to benefit a little bit from that, just from the standpoint that those guys, are weaker defenders at the point of attack. But nonetheless, it was exciting to see that they were able to weather the storm to an extent without Luka. It's the first time we've really seen it this season. Also, really the first time that we've in a stretch where, well, not a stretch, but in a game where Luka's not playing, that we saw McKinley Wright and Jaden Hardy get real minutes. If I recall, in the previous 4 matchups, they really weren't as much part of the rotation, or they were with the legends. Maybe they played a little bit in that 4th matchup, but I know for sure in those first 3 games Luka was out. I don't remember them playing as far as my recollection serves me. So, it is kind of compelling to see that the Mavericks were able to do this in a game that Luka was out. But in conclusion, I just don't think it was a big enough sample size for me to really, jump the gun and say, oh, like they have enough offensive firepower and playmaking to be able to sustain Luka being out, nor do Jaden Hardy or McKinley Wright's ascension, even though they have provided great minutes, and I'm very excited about how they can maybe fare out in the future, especially Hardy. I don't think neither of those guys are consistent enough yet for me to be like, okay, like the third ball handler situation's fine, right? That they still definitely have some woes that they're going to have to attend to in terms of the playmaking department. Both of those guys can score, and Wright, he's even probably a better facilitator than we give him credit for, definitely a better facilitator than Hardy. But I still wouldn't go as far as to be like, okay, like these guys are the third playmakers, on this roster. So, I guess kind of after, peeling back from that, we kind of diagnosed, some of the offensive woes with the Mavericks, but also some of the positives within these two games. I talked a lot about Dinwiddie and how he was able to just come downhill, draw so many fouls within both of these games, particularly that second game, and how he was shooting so well. Really creating for himself as much as he could, taking advantage of those matchups when he got matched up on a Simons or Lillard, just basically taking to the rim, posting up. He always does such a good job posting up against these smaller guards. Christian Wood obviously weathered the storm despite a bad shooting night on that second end of the back-to-back in which he played. And, once he really started to get going, he was able to serve as a great offense. He had 4 offensive rebounds. He was doing good in the pick and roll despite not having Luka to open up as much space to operate with. He was still finding ways to be a good rim roller and rim runner when the opportunity presented itself. And, he was taking Nurkic off the dribble a few times. So in a game where he didn't shoot the best, it was encouraging to see that he still had, a great 23 and 16 double-double despite him having a bad shooting night. So obviously we talked a lot about, those guys offensively, but we do talk about a lot of those guys game to game. 2 guys that I really want to get into, of course, are going to be Jaden Hardy and Frank Ntilikina. I guess first starting with Hardy, he obviously didn't play as much in that first game, but particularly in that second game, speak to how he was able to score and, what, if any, playmaking he was able to provide within the half-court offense, barring just his transition opportunities and the catch and shoot threes that were created, via when the Blazers were blitzing Dinwiddie in a pick and roll, and he simply was just the outlet guy or got a hockey assist from Dinwiddie in a scenario like that. Like, what exactly was he doing from a creation aspect and a transition aspect and, just being able to attack off closeouts, things of that nature? How was he able to really furbish himself on the offensive end in that second game? And then we'll get to Ntilikina after that.
Yeah, Jaden Hardy, he did an amazing job. Necessarily in that second matchup, he did an amazing job just sort of driving. And his drives, let me just say, like, he is so quick off the first step. Just the way that he can create his own offense simply by driving and simply by just going downhill with the ball is just insane. Especially for how young he is and how inexperienced he is at the pro level. It's honestly incredible. And, the way that he can contort his body into like drawing fouls and sort of, getting the and one and finishing, it's crazy. And that's sort of, everything in a nutshell of what we saw from him in that second matchup. Getting to the foul line, making open jump, or he went 3 of 10 from 3-point line, but the 3 makes that he did make were pretty impressive. But yeah, just an efficient night at the rim, I would say, is where we saw most of his field goals made and attempted. And getting to the foul line, he had multiple and ones, multiple times where he was able to get to the foul line. In sort of his, facilitating mode, he's just a little too ball hoggish, but that's kind of how he runs his offense. Is just, him and a guy or getting triple teams or whatever it may be. That's just how he does it. But yeah, we saw him multiple times just sort of pass up on an open jumper, or not pass up on an open jumper, but pass up on an open jump shooter, and instead taking it to the hoop. And sometimes it resulted in a stupid result, and sometimes he got to the foul line because of it.
No, yeah, 100%. His finishing is honestly maybe, if not better than Dinwiddie's, at least equal to it. And his ability to contort his body midair and absorb contact and still have, presence of mind to be able to like finish with either hand is really like wildly impressive. I mean, it's not even really something that like Luka has, because yes, like Luka can contort his body and finish in all these sort of different ways, but the hang time that we were seeing from Jaden Hardy, in this 25-point outing, and some of his other really good offensive performances this season, I mean, it's like comparable to like really like two guys that we were actually watching both these games with, Simons and Lillard. Like when they get to the basket, like they can hang with whatever rim protectors up there for a second or two, and they're able to finish at the rim. And to be able to, see Hardy potentially develop into like a Simons-esque player one day is very captivating and intriguing to me. And I mean, his offensive performance the other night was very emblematic of the ability to get out in transition, hit, catch and shoot threes, attack off closeouts. And I mean, occasionally we saw a couple pick and rolls that he ran with Wood where he was able to get downhill and score, just comes off a lot of curl offs and DHOs. Like there's a play where they ran for him a few times over the last couple games, I've noticed, where he gets a down screen at the weak side wing, comes off, it gets the ball at like the nail and just goes like straight downhill from there and uses his quickness to get to the rim. And he has such good touch on his shots where he's able to get it like high up there on the glass and it's able to drop. So there's a lot of different things that they can kind of run with him, even if not involving him as a secondary or third playmaker. Just a lot of different offensive actions that, just because of how diverse his offensive portfolio is, that they're able to do those sort of things, right? So I think we got the full array of things from Jaden Hardy. I mean, good and bad in that game. I mean, yes, it was a wildly impressive offensive performance, but at the same time, there were a lot of those, clumsy turnovers, like rookie mistakes. Like I alluding to one time, I can't remember the scenario specifically, but I remember Hardy went up and just got his absolute like life swatted away by, I believe, do you recall who it was by?
Was it Sharp?
It might have been Sharp.
Yeah.
Damn near like snatch blocked him. And obviously, like having the presence of mind to know when to drive and when to not, and not to take on 3-on-1 scenarios and slow it down a little bit and, make the right read. Those are still going to be things in the developmental process. But I mean, they said it on the broadcast last night. And I mean, obviously he kind of says some outlandish things sometimes, but I mean, Derek Harper said the guy is forming up to be a star in this league at some point. And I mean, just the way that he projects already, if he's able to really iron out some of the intricacies and fine tune the little aspects of his game offensively that involve, just taking a step back and really reading out the situation, because all that's teachable, because the talent is, I think it speaks for itself. And I honestly, he could be a great steal for where the Mavericks got him at pick 32nd last year's, or pick 37th in last year's draft.
No, for sure. Especially the sort of, I guess, value at which the Mavericks drafted him with that 37th pick and just trading, I think it was a future second for him.
2 future seconds to the Kings.
2 future seconds. Yeah, I knew it was 1 or 2. Honestly, I mean, this guy, I know it's really early, but he could be a perennial like offensive star in this league, given a few more years and some development and, just some scenarios that we need to put him in. But this game, has to get you excited at least to see what he can do in the future and see what he can produce with Luka around him. I know Luka wasn't involved in this game at all, but even still, I mean, the future's bright. Having him come off the bench, for the next probably year, even if he finds some sort of a role before the playoffs or even during the playoffs, that'd be huge. And then in his second year, I mean, if he can involve and be productive off the bench consistently, I mean, that would just be amazing for, just his future rise and also just what, in a few years from now, because we knew this would be a project whenever we drafted him. We knew it'd take a few years, but just to develop this guy year by year is just something that I think the Mavericks pretty much need to do. But yeah, I mean, seeing him do this and pop off for 25, I know it wasn't against the best, sort of team, because again, I mean, they were up by quite a bit at the point that he started going, but even still, I mean, that just has to get you a little excited.
No, 100%. It was a very exciting game from that standpoint. Anytime we get to see a Hardy party performance, we're always going to be psyched over here at Mainstream Mavs. But next, I know you want to get a little, before we like dip into the defense of both of these two games, of course, you wanted to talk a little bit about Frank and his offensive production. I mean, me personally, I didn't really see anything out of the norm in these last 2 games for him, or anything that really threw me a left hook and was like, oh, that surprised me. This is new from Frank, but I do think that there's something there in terms of we're actually seeing a little bit of an offensive uh, consistency in his game. He's not, he's having less and less of these, like, I know he had a 1-for-5 game, but I mean, he's contributing something on that end rather than kind of just perpetually standing in a corner, whether, it's the occasional attack off a closeout, or, him pulling up for a little floater, or just making a catch and shoot three. He does a lot, and he looks a lot more confident out there. Something
Yeah, he
he
does.
definitely doesn't look as timid. He's actually running out in transition. I mean, obviously the defense is, his stronghold, but I mean, he had 7 assists the other night, and, a lot of it was, virtue of, just being a good ball mover, but he was able to find some guys in the pick and roll a few times and, get downhill and make a few good passes. Do you think that he actually has a spot in this rotation now? I think that that's probably what you were trying to get at with when you wanted to, you're like, hey, Will, let's do a little segment on Frank. And I was like, do you think, and I guess my first question there was like, okay, like, is this you trying to say that you're just kind of impressed by the last little stretch by him? Or do you think that he like legitimately has something to contribute at the end of the bench?
No, I mean, I think it's fair to say, of course, I think it was the first matchup where he really started to like score the ball a little bit. But I've been impressed by him all season. I think, he's definitely a comparable guy off the bench. I'm not saying he's going to start. I'm not saying he's, in these numbers of one of the most improved players on the team. I'm not saying that by any means, but the guy, he has some sort of an offensive touch finally, whether that be, just finding the right guy, finding the open guy around the horn or whatever it may be. We've seen him develop this sort of mid-range jumper that I don't think we've seen in years past.
No.
And also, I mean, he's not consistently, but he's at least shooting 3 ball 1 to 2 times a game, and making, usually one of those, if he shoots more than 2. I think that that's just really comparable to this offense. I'm not saying he's going to produce, a lot on that end. The defense comes with it, of course. I think that's, as you said, that's definitely a strong suit. That's definitely has been a strong suit throughout his career. But yeah, just being able to, sort of attack off these sort of closeouts, and, just get a little mid-range pop. That's definitely huge. We also saw him attack the paint a little bit. We got to see him, sort of attack Nurkic a little bit and get some down low points, and even just operate in the pick and roll, being the sort of facilitator in that. I think that was huge to what we, could see out of him. I'm not saying, again, like he's going to start or anything like that, but a comparable guy off the bench to, not alleviate ball pressure or ball handling or anything like that, but he can at least bring some pressure to the defense that I don't think a lot of teams really even realized that he'd had. I know for a fact, coming into this season, we definitely didn't think that he had this, and to see him develop this has definitely been, huge in his remark and also for the team.
Yeah, I mean, it's a small sample size, so I don't know how much credence I take to, some sort of insane offensive game, like newly and widely renowned Frank Ntilikina offensive game. He's not, stepping into the role of the third ball handler or anything like that. But I will say as much that he does look a little more competent on offense. He does look a little more comfortable. He's at least not, just stand in the corner and only shoot threes. He was always definitely going to be project more so as a 3-and-D player versus a third ball handler. I think that that's a very, that narrative definitely still applies and carries over. But at the same time, I think we do have to recognize that him at least filling in the gaps in some areas where he at times last year didn't even look like an offensive basketball player. Now he actually looks like halfway competent. I do think it does make him maybe at least applicable to fill in the gaps at the end of that rotation, maybe be the last guy in the rotation that gets time. I mean, I'm sure that'll kind of be when the roster's fully healthy. Like Hardy will get some minutes, he'll get some minutes, but I do think he's carved out a little bit of a role for himself. He got the start the other night. Like he's doing some different things that are actually pretty contributory to the team. And, all while doing that, he's still playing really good defense. Even the other night, I know he had quite like the Herculean task of having to slow down Simons and Lillard and, in different stretches, having to apply on ball pressure to both of those guys. Nobody's really going to be able to defend them. a lot of times he got caught up behind a screen or something and was just not able to recover. But I mean, I thought he did about as good of a job on them as one can really hope. I thought he, in that second game in particular, he did a pretty decent job on Simons. Lillard is by all means necessary, just a complete, like, I guess, just unfazed offensive player. No matter really what you throw at him, if he's on, he's on. So, yeah. And in these last two games, he definitely was. So from that perspective, I was impressed by Frank. But, like I kind of was alluding to there, let's go ahead and get into the defense these last two games before we end the podcast. Where do you think where's the Mavericks' biggest liability in these last two games? And, I guess outside of Lillard, who is going to be able to attack and get downhill and virtually do kind of whatever he wants, regardless if the Mavericks had their full array of defenders out there, he still would have had a very positive impact on the game for the Trailblazers. What kind of rubbed you the wrong way about these last two games? Even though we know the Mavericks personnel excuses, I'm not trying to, throw them shade and, try to act as if their injuries don't exist and that they were just the most healthy squad in the world, ready to, counter an uber talented offensive team in the Trailblazers. But, there were some noticeable, wrongdoings and a lot of misrotations, things of that nature. What was going wrong on defense?
Yeah, I mean, strictly, this has been the problem since we saw Dorian and Josh get hurt. It's been perimeter defense. And I mean, again, like late rotations, as you said just a minute ago, it's definitely not helped the Mavericks case to build, somewhat of a defensive DNA throughout this stretch of these guys being injured the last few weeks. But I mean, Portland, I'm not saying that they're a bad 3-point shooting team. I'm actually not sure what their numbers are all season, but getting 44 shots up in that second matchup and then getting 41 shots up in that first matchup, both making 17 in the game. I mean, that just speaks volume to what this perimeter defense has been able to do. I know Nurkic, particularly in that first matchup, was able to operate really good down low. And that was, again, due to the absence of Christian Wood, just sticking to Dwight on Nurkic. Again, he got an early foul. Dwight that being in the first matchup got in really early foul trouble. He had like 4 fouls in that second quarter, I think. Definitely hindered the Mavericks. And seemingly, as soon as that happened, Portland was just able to pretty much go downhill whenever they pleased. I know JaVale's not the most comparable. He's not the most, alleviating big man in the league. But yeah, I mean, that was definitely something that I noticed was as soon as I guess Nurkic was able to exploit the defense or exploit the offense. Exploit the defense of Dwight Powell and everything like that. It just seemingly fell apart from there. But yeah, I mean, late rotations involved 3-point shooting. And I mean, Portland did not have a absence of 3-point shooting, again, putting up an insane 41.5% in that first matchup. And then I think it was like 39% actually, which I'm sure is over their team average. But yeah, I mean, and this is, again, I mean, this isn't a case of Portland just making shots. Again, I mean, they shot an insane clip at both these games, but you have to realize, like, teams have been shooting an insane clip. The Clippers, they shot an insane clip over the Mavericks.
No, these are all like wide open shots.
Yeah, all wide open shots. That's the point that I'm getting at. Is like, it's the Mavericks defense is that that's what's allowing these shots to be so open and just honestly, I mean, a jump shot or a warm-up shot at that point. But yeah, I mean, we've seen time after time, Jeremy Grant, he got an open shot. We even saw Anthony Simons get multiple open shots, and that's like their leading 3-point shooter, I believe, in both these matchups. I mean, it was just nice that the Mavericks at least had some form of offense in both these games to where they could, do the part and at least be hip to hip to this team for at least a while in both these matchups. But I mean, the perimeter defense is definitely what led to the Mavericks' downfall. Just the sheer amount of shooting that Portland could get outside only led to the collapse and eventually Dwight getting in foul trouble or whatever it was. Christian Wood was definitely a huge addition in that second matchup, but even still, it just kind of seemed like Portland, as soon as they saw the first matchup and as soon as they saw what they could exploit on the offensive side of things, they were just like, okay, well, this is gonna be wraps. Y'all don't have Luka. I mean, good luck. So that's the big thing that I noticed was definitely perimeter defense, just being late rotations, whether it was Hardy. Yeah, I mean, there's multiple guys that I can point out, but I mean, that was really the big thing. I think perimeter defense just led to the downfall and eventually, led to inside scoring by Lillard, Nurkic, of course. We even saw Shaden Sharp get involved in there a few times, even Anthony Simons. I mean, there's just multiple guys that you can point out.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of those are great points as to why the Mavericks defense was as liable it was these last two games, just in terms of the dribble penetration that they were allowing. I mean, I'm not going to try to, basically exclude the fact that the, Trailblazers point of attack offensive players are, really prevalent and really good. I mean, you got a guy in Jeremy Grant who's able to take basically any smaller defender into the low post, shoot over them, get to the rim with a variety of different sort of stop and go dribble moves and Euro steps. Lillard and Simons are lethal coming downhill. Both can hit a shot when a guy goes under on a screen. I mean, I'm not saying it's not a lot to deal with. Obviously, the Mavericks would be able to counter a little more of it if they weren't as injury depleted as they were. I mean, even like tactically, they kind of tried as much as they really could. They didn't really go to, that 2-3, that coveted like 2-3 zone that we see them go to at times amidst this 2-game stretch. The Blazers did play some zone throughout a lot of the time, which the Mavericks, I thought, actually on offense did a decent job getting to the middle of their zone at times. There were some times where the Blazers were definitely able to force the action. The Mavericks had to hoist up some late shot clock threes, just in terms of how good they were, in terms of how synchronized they were on that zone, especially like when Lillard and Simons were at the game and some of those late game lineups, more so garbage time minutes when they were just throwing like their young wings out there. I mean, like they got some guys that can guard, that's for sure. Even though they may not have the best on and off like defensive numbers because of what their starting lineup is, they do have a lot of good defenders, but just the stylistically how they have to play, having to include Lillard, Simons, and Nurkic in that starting lineup, it obviously limits your defensive versatility a little. But I mean, the Trailblazers, the good thing about them come playoff time is they will be able to throw some defensive lineups if need be, that are going to be a lot more lethal than I think, some of the ones that they've included thus far in the regular season. But to say the least, pointing back to the Mavericks defense, like they tried some matchup zone on Lillard. They were blitzing him in the pick and roll a few times, especially in that second game more so. I honestly thought that they should have doubled Lillard more just in terms of how lethal he was. I mean, there was legitimately no answer. I mean, there was like one play where he had like that and one, I believe it was either Bertans or Christian Wood, where he was just like falling back and just like hoisted up and it just dropped it. I mean, he was after a previous 2-game stint. I mean, I believe it was had the Mavericks only played the Trailblazers once before this?
No, after this most recent game, they split the series 2-2. So they played 2 times before.
Okay, yeah, so they played 2 times before. And Lillard definitely wasn't as prevalent in those matchups at the AAC, but in these last two, I mean, he was on one. There was virtually no stopping him. So I think that they should have maybe deferred to doubling him a little more. Maybe, playing a little more of that matchup zone now, albeit when they were playing matchup zone, Tim Hardaway Jr. was like the lead ball handling defender. So, I mean, the Blazers were kind of able to decipher that code pretty quick and get things moving on the agenda and really derail that. So the Mavericks didn't really go to that all too often, but I think they had a variety of things that they could have maybe tried. I would take my chances with Simon attacking off a closeout versus Lillard one-on-one with anybody. I mean, like he's one of the best players on the game. And I mean, throughout he may not get the most national media coverage just because he's been doing it in the same place for so long. But I mean, night in, night out, I mean, this guy's on a tear right now. He's averaging like 35 through his last like few games. I mean, especially in that second game where I wasn't, getting my full diet of getting to soak in Luka's greatness. I really got a chance to soak in Dame's greatness. And I know we don't really talk too glowingly about other guys on this podcast or go like wildly in depth into them. We'll of course mention them, but I mean, that was his 2-game stretch against the Mavericks was definitely one of the more impressive performances I've seen from any player against the Mavs this season. It may have not been the most Herculean effort in terms of the amount of points he scored. And, there's been some guys that maybe gone off for more. But I mean, just in terms of being able to affect the game at all 3 levels offensively, just in terms of how multifaceted he is, how he operates within the pick and roll, just coming off down screen, shooting. Like, he just does everything. I mean, he's one of the best players in the game still, and even as he's creeping over 30. I mean, so I mean that was really a privilege to be able to watch him. But besides that, I mean, what else did you notice from the Mavericks defensively or offensively for that matter, before we kind of end this podcast here that, you either liked, disliked, just, any, if you want to maybe mention a few players that got to play, I know Theo Pinson got a little bit of run in both of these games. Like, you want to talk about anybody else before we end the podcast?
Yeah. I guess just running down the score sheet here, I felt like Theo had a very productive second game. He played 21 minutes in this matchup, or the first matchup is where he had a productive game. Let me see, let me pull this up. So yeah, he played 13 minutes, but it was pretty productive 13 minutes. Whether it was, passing the ball or, making the right reads. He even scored the ball. He had 11 points in this matchup. I think that, I'm not saying again that's anything new or anything like that, but I just think it was actually good to see a positive game from him. This is probably like his best game of the season. Reggie Bullock, I guess it would be doing him a disservice if we don't talk about his insane shooting night of that first game.
I mean, even the second game, like, it wasn't the most wildly impressive second game, but I mean, he carried over at a decent clip, went 2 for 6 from 3, 4 for 9 from the field. Actually got a few layups that were, came off some 50-50 balls and things of that nature. So, he, the offense honestly seems like it's starting to get mended, which is great. I mean, this is the turn that we see from him at every, turn of the new year. But I mean, the defense on the other hand is just still not there. Like, that's one of the main reasons as to why I would label him one of the more expendable players on the Mavericks, not because of the offensive game. I'm happy it's turning around, and it really seems like I think we have enough of a sample size to say that's going in the right direction now, from December onward, really. But the defense just isn't what it was last year. He's getting blown by a lot more often. He's, his main asset that he brought defensively to this team was the ability to guard 1 through 3 as good as he did. His foot speed and his lateral quickness on full display. I mean, I'm almost more comfortable putting him on bigger guys at this point, because he's just kind of so quick to get blown by. It almost seems like it's more so that than any sort of defensive intangible thing. It just seems like, I don't know, his foot speed, his athleticism starting to wane a little bit. That's just my observation. Do you have any answers as to why his defense might be falling off? But, before you answer that, like I said, for me specifically too, all power to him. That shooting game he had the first game was insane, going 8 for 10 from 3 off those Luka pick and pops. He was being a great outlet in terms of that. And I mean, he carried it over in the second game. So all power to his offense. But to speak to his defense, like I was alluding to, what do you think is the causation of this defensive fall off this year from Reggie Bullock?
Yeah, I don't really know if you can point it towards one thing. I think it's just a correlation of multiple things. I mean, he definitely, producing as much as he did in that playoff series, or really all playoffs long, I think that definitely took a toll on his body. I know he had a shorter offseason than most guys in the league. And, also just being the sort of, especially through this stretch, he's had to been the main defender on that starting five. It definitely takes a toll on a guy's body, especially at his age. I don't remember, what is he like? Did he just turn 30 or?
He's, I think 31 at this point.
31. Okay.
Yeah. For you
yeah. But yeah, I mean, just it takes a toll. It doesn't matter how many minutes you play, it takes a toll.
Yeah, he's 31. He'll be 32 on March 16th.
Okay, so yeah, so he's almost 32. I definitely think it'll be an interesting story to kind of see as we inch closer to the playoffs, if that sort of intensity, if that sort of energy that he brings and did bring throughout last year kind of comes back a little bit, especially in the playoffs. But I mean, from here on out, every game matters. I'm interested to see, like I said, as we inch closer, what kind of energy, what kind of hustle he brings. We've seen glimpses of it throughout games here and there, but we just haven't seen a full game of him putting a true defensive stamp on anybody this season. And is that age? Is he possibly dealing with something that we don't know, an injury or whatever? I mean, it could be everything. I definitely think age factors into it. I know he had a neck injury that definitely slows up your mobility earlier in the season, but again, it doesn't seem like he's had any bothering sort of lingering issue. So I don't really know unless if there's something behind closed doors that we just don't know about. But in terms of his offense, at least, it has definitely been on the rise since the December, really since Christmas, honestly. But it's good to see him finally, get I think it was like his first game shooting, or it was a career game. He never made 8 threes in a single game. So that was definitely good to see him knock some down. But yeah, defensively, I just think it's, every excuse that you can come up with him, age, maybe possibly an injury. I think it all just pertains into why his production has been off.
Yeah, no, I mean, you bring some great points up there as to why that could be the case. We technically don't know, but it'll be interesting to see how long this carries over, if he is able to turn the tide on that end a little bit. But right now, it definitely, warrants him being probably a less valued player than he was for us last year. I mean, I think that's fair to say, especially with the emergence of Josh Green.
No, I mean, if you look at our discussions that we had before the season even started, this was the for sure in doubt. If you like, there was no discussion about it. Reggie Bullock was the guy you put on the main point guard. Now, without question, I would defer to Josh Green for that point. I just think, I don't think we realized that his defense would decline as much as it did, but I mean, here we are.
Yeah, no, exactly. That's a great point you make there. Just shouting out some other guys that played in these matchups. We've obviously kind of covered everybody else. Like you alluded to with Theo Pinson, he did a good job making some threes in garbage time in that first game, but didn't really get as much of an actual run as he did in the second game. He's a good floor spacer. If his 3-point shot actually starts coming along, he's, 4 for, I guess, what would he be, like 4 for 9 in his last 2 games? So if that ever starts trending in the right direction, that'd be interesting. We saw him as the lead, or bringing the ball up the floor, rather, I guess not the lead ball in, where he kind of quickly deferred to, Spencer or Jaden Hardy, in these minutes in this last game. But he actually got a little bit of a run. Wasn't a complete liability on defense, wasn't like Tim level or Spencer when he doesn't care on defense level. But it, he's definitely not as much of a splashy defender, so much that it like kind of offsets the very inconsistent shooting and playmaking. So, I mean, I know that he's obviously the, cheerleader and, whatever other term you want to denote to him in terms of being that guy that's the morale booster and all that sort of stuff. But I mean, he is a player on this team and he does have a skill set. Now, it's kind of comes down to whether that skill set is going to be consistent enough for him to get consistent minutes. But I don't think I was happy he knocked down a few threes. I think he definitely furthered his case to not be waived if the Mavericks ever had to do something this season, to at least kind of stick around in case something happens. But I don't think these 2 games definitely move the needle for me in terms of being like, oh, Theo Pinson needs to be part of the rotation. I think that it was just merely due to the shortages that this team has because of injuries. Davis actually did halfway decent in these games. I mean, typical black holeness on defense, but he had a couple interesting, it was more reminiscent of last year's playoffs where he knocked down a couple threes and then he had like 1 or 2 possessions where it looked like he was actually an NBA basketball player on the defensive side of things. So I honestly wasn't too mad about that. I wish he would just do it more consistently. So his $16 million contract isn't, because if he was able to do that more consistently, his $16 million contract would just be kind of seen more as a very large overpay versus like, 16 times or 16-fold overpay, because he probably should be making about the minimum.
Yeah.
So, I mean, maybe he at least at that clip is like a $4 or $5 million player when he can, hit some shots and, occasionally not be a black hole in defense, maybe 1 of every 5 possessions. So, I'm happy he had a good 2-game stretch. I'm sure he'll kind of teeter in and out of the rotation as shooting is needed accordingly. McKinley Wright played solid in these last 2 games. I mean, nothing new from him. Got some minutes where he was asked to handle the ball, made a couple shots, got into the paint. Consistent, good defense. He had that one block on Dame at the end of the third quarter of the second game. That was really nice where he stepped up and, for a guy at 5'11", like literally my height, to be able to get up like that, it's really impressive. So happy for him that he's still kind of sticking around the rotation. I'm really interested to see. I mean, I can't tell you for sure how everything's going to materialize. But when everybody's fully healthy, I'm really interested to see if any of those guys like McKinley Wright, Davis, Jaden Hardy, Frank, like how many of those guys actually kind of seep out of that I'm only playing right now because everybody's hurt part of the rotation to, hey, they can actually serve a couple minutes if need be within the regular like 9-10 man rotation. That's going to be interesting for me, especially if we don't make a move or anything like that. AJ Lawson got a little bit of run in both these games, admittedly, both of them in garbage time, but came in, played some solid defense, and made a 3 and 1. So good for him. I really like his profile as a player and just in terms of how he projects. I'd like to see him maybe get a little more run over Theo or, just maybe seep into some minutes. I mean, I don't know. I think he's worth giving a shot at just in terms of how good he played in summer league, but didn't really get to play all too much, but it'll be interesting to see if he's contributing a little in garbage time if he gets any minutes going forward. I think that's something to wonder. JaVale didn't play in the second game at all, but he played in the first game. He had like, it was kind of the full diet of JaVale McGee. You got like a really nice highlight block. I think it was on like Simons or something like that in that first game where he got the whole bench up and rowdy. And on top of that, you alluded to this with Dwight Powell getting like mixed up in the pick and roll, obviously earlier. And, Lillard and Nurkic, especially when Nurkic starts stretching the floor, just being so hard to stop that sort of duo because their offense is able to kind of dissipate outwards from that, whether they want to give it to Simons at that point, who has a mismatch, or give it to Grant to just go one-on-one with some guy. But I mean, JaVale, he was no different from Powell in the fact that even probably more so amplified from Powell, he was getting kind of lost on defense at times, unable to step up, especially when on Dame, was getting blown by a lot, was allowing a lot of things to sort of seep through, and wasn't able to protect the rim as well as you would have hoped. He had a couple decent highlight plays, but I mean, besides that, it was typical JaVale. So, and yeah, I mean, I think that kind of like wraps it up. I think we gave you guys kind of the full diet in terms of these two games, the offensive and defensive woes, but also the offensive positives, as well as, somehow these role players that we may not be seeing for too much longer once these guys come back from injury, how, maybe a couple of them are able to kind of make their way out of this sort of territory of only getting to play because of injuries to possibly being at the end of the bench. So, I mean, it'll be interesting. It's a rough 2-game stretch for the Mavs. I'm interested to see what happens tomorrow night against a definitely waning and whining Hawks team that is having a lot of things kind of go wrong with their situation over there. But they're obviously still pretty uber talented. So I'm not going to put it past the Mavericks that it is going to be an easy game by any means, especially incorporating these guys back from injury. Even if Tim's not playing, I presume Luka is going to be back and Josh and Dorian. So I'm excited for next game to see what happens. I'm excited to see who all plays. If, seeing how Jaden Hardy's going to, I assume he'll still probably get some run with Tim being out and everything. It's going to be a fun game to watch. And, it's a rough 2-game stretch. And, we obviously talked a lot just regarding the direction of the team when we did our halfway marking podcast. We did our 41-game podcast. And we talked a lot about how this team definitely, how we wish that they could just pick a direction and, go one way, whether that's contending or, going to Loserdome. But at the end of the day, they're kind of in this state of mediocrity until whenever the time is moves to be made, even if it's not this trade deadline, whether it's over the offseason or whenever. And, you kind of tread the water and, we have to operate under the assumption that we want this team to win and we want them to continue to do good and we want them to win games because that's just kind of the situation we are right now. That's what Luka wants. And, that's what we have to expect as a fan. So obviously a tough 2-game stretch for the Mavericks, but nonetheless, hopefully we're able to bounce back here on Wednesday versus the Hawks. Unless you got anything else, I think that's going to do it for us today, Jaren.
Yeah, I pretty much summed it up. I'm interested to see, this could be a potential play-in matchup, but other than that,
the play-in matchup, the Hawks are in the East.
Or no, I'm talking about the Blazers. My bad.
Yeah. I think a lot of people have started to label the Mavericks in that, they're a definite playoff team. I mean, I wouldn't go that far yet. I mean, everything's so tightly packed together in the West.
It's starting to slip up over these last 5 games, I would say. So
yeah, things are getting volatile. I mean, who knows what the Blazers are going to take it from here because they had a little bit of a rough stretch. They seem to start they seem like they're starting to remediate things. So we'll see what happens, but it'll be an interesting little stretch here to say the least. But besides that, you can find us on YouTube, where we are now at the Mainstream Mavs podcast on YouTube. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Shout out to the YouTube gang for those of you guys watching us on that platform. Make sure to follow us on Twitter at mainstream_Mavs. We post updates, we post all our podcasts, and we live tweet during games, things of that nature. Make sure to, if you're listening on Anchor or Spotify or Apple Podcasts, whatever podcast platform you are listening on, make sure to subscribe and give us a 5-star rating if you feel so pleased. And we appreciate you guys listening this far in the podcast, if you made it this far. And I mean, with that being said, yeah, we love y'all support. I was just trying to come up with some sort of a little I was trying to come up with little like praise to the fans here, because I feel like I don't give you guys enough credit. For those of you guys who do listen, support us. It really means the world to us, and we got a lot of different things that we're going to be doing over this next little stretch that we're excited about. So, we'll definitely be announcing that to you guys accordingly, and, we'll be steadfast in how we're going to operate with that. So, stay tuned for that. But besides that, we will catch you guys in the next one. We will be back Wednesday night after the Hawks game. There will be a surprise. There will be a surprise on the podcast.
Oh yeah, there will be. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.